May 4th. Thank you. So we are, as you heard from the calendar announcements, making our way toward the end of the week of Passover. I hope everybody's week was wonderful and inspiring. I hope your seders were meaningful. I hope that they gave you a chance to connect with loved ones and, just as importantly, to reconnect with the foundational story about freedom and homecoming, about redemption and self-determination that are right at the central core of what it means to be a Jew in the world. Seder night is, I don't have to remind you, a night of questions. The reciting of the 4 questions, which has become a tradition in many of our families that's reserved as an honor for the youngest child in the household, that custom actually evolved from a 2nd century guideline in the Mishnah, the early code of organized Jewish law, that suggests that if we want our kids to really learn about their history, to absorb and internalize the story of the Exodus, the best way to teach them that is to use the Socratic method, to ask them probing questions, to elicit one answer, which will be followed by another question, and then another and another, to help draw out the truth and lead them to a comprehensive understanding of the story of our freedom. So this past week, I encountered a great question, one that I hadn't thought about before, and one that led me to a deeper place in my own understanding about Passover and the Jewish legacy of freedom and salvation. Here's the question. For the Israelites in Egypt, when did their liberation begin? Okay, the simplest answer maybe would be to say that their freedom started when the sea split and they walked out of Egypt. The Israelites at that point got the first indisputable, first-hand confirmation of God's existence. They escaped from Pharaoh and his men who had kept them enslaved. They walked onto dry land in control of their own destiny for the first time. So that is a good answer, but it's not the only answer. Another perspective holds that the Israelites didn't really become free until they made it to Sinai, until they made it to the mountain where God spoke to them and presented them with a code of religious law that would unify the people as a nation of ethical monotheists. That perspective asserts that we didn't and we couldn't have become free until we heard and accepted the necessary limits on our freedom that come from living under the law. Or maybe we push the start date to Israelite freedom in the other direction. Maybe we push it back, and maybe the answer is that the Israelites became free before the parting of the sea. Maybe they first won the beginning of their freedom with the 10th plague, which demonstrated the unstoppable force of God's power in Egypt. Or maybe it happened at the first plague, which showed God's presence in time and space in the real world. Maybe even earlier, maybe the first seeds of our freedom were planted at the burning bush, when God's plan for Israel was revealed to Moses. Maybe much earlier than that. Maybe it began when Joseph settled down and raised his family in Egypt. Maybe, ironically, our freedom first began when we became subject to the will of others. There's a provocative little teaching that I want to share with you that appears in a 3rd century collection of rabbinic lore and stories about the Exodus. So when they're talking about the stories of the Exodus, this text asserts, without further explanation, as follows: no slave at any time ever left Egypt. No slave at any time ever left Egypt. And when it says that, it's not saying that the Exodus story is a lie. It's not saying that the events of the Torah didn't happen. It's saying, I think, that freedom began when we became capable of seeing ourselves as free people. We had to divest ourselves of our slave mentality, to leave bondage behind and begin comporting ourselves in the way God expected us to, as subjects of the law and subjects of the divine, not laborers in service to Pharaoh. Because if we continued thinking about ourselves as slaves, we couldn't ever really become free. Even if we walked through a sea which by miraculous hand had been parted for us, our minds would still remain in captivity. And yet, even though today we're still commanded to remember that we are free people, to make our freedom matter most, we have to remember that once upon a time we were not. I learned something interesting about the technology of making matzah. So you know how when you look at a piece of matzah, it's got those perforations all over it, right? The grid of little holes that cover the whole sheet of matzah. So you might have thought that they were there to make it easier to break, because, right, that's obviously wrong. When you break a piece of matzah, it never goes along the line and you get matzah shrapnel all over your lap. No, the holes are not there to break along. The holes are there to let air escape and heat go in so that the heat in the oven will penetrate evenly through the whole piece of matzah, so it'll bake at a uniform rate and prevent any cooler spots where dough might cook more slowly and rise more than matzah is supposed to. Now you learn something about matzah. So for centuries and centuries, matzah bakers have been making holes in their dough. But before matzah was produced by machines in factories, the holes used to be made with a hand roller that had little pins embedded in it. And a long time ago, 14 or 1500 years ago, the popular style was to use rollers with pins that were placed in a special pattern so that when they rolled over the matzah dough, the holes they made would imprint on the finished matzah a picture. And the most popular style of that picture was to print matzah with a pattern that looked like chains to remind us of our slavery. And every time a person ate a piece of that matzah, they would remember that their ancestors had been in bondage. Now, the practice of imprinting matzah with those special perforated images came to an end in the 19th century when industrialization replaced community matzah bakers with factories and machinery. The matzah baking factories could produce far more matzah in far less time with perfect uniformity of shape and size than ever would have been possible if the task were still being done by hand. But interestingly, when matzah baking machines became widespread in Europe and North America, the technology led to a vicious debate among the rabbis of the day about whether or not matzah made by a machine could ever be considered kosher. You cannot imagine the intensity of the disagreements on this topic. There was one Jewish historian who called this, in his words, one of the most acrimonious discussions in the history of Jewish law about whether machine-made matzah could be kosher. So one objection to the use of matzah-making machines was about whether they would get cleaned often enough to make sure that there would be no tiny little morsels of dough that would become leavened by accident and then mixed in with the kosher matzah. That's one argument. Another argument was that the baking of matzah, after all, is a mitzvah. It's a religious obligation that requires spiritual centeredness and intention that machines are not capable of. That's the second argument. But the third and most energetic objection, the biggest sticking point to allowing matzah to be made by machines, was on the question of human dignity as a necessary component of human liberty. See, up until the 1850s or so, baking matzah for a community on Passover was a role that was often taken on by people who lived at the margins of society. It was time-limited, it was seasonal work, it was very hard, it required long hours in a hot kitchen, and it required lots of people who'd be available to work long hours for a very intense few weeks and then go on their way without any expectation of continued employment. So jobs in the matzah bakery were generally not held by full-time cooks or bakers. They went first to the poor, to widows, to children who were orphans, to those who were not young or able-bodied enough to have full-time work during the year, but who nevertheless needed reliable financial support. And so the rabbis who argued most vociferously against machine-made matzah were worried about partly about whether it would be kosher, but mostly about what would happen to the most vulnerable members of their community if industrialization took away a source of income and self-reliance for the poor. They ultimately lost the debate. Almost all of the world's matzah today is made by machines, but their argument remains compelling. Those rabbis were right. to worry that industrial matzah factories would create an untenable circumstance in which, as part, ironically, of our preparations to fulfill a holiday mitzvah, we'd be contributing to the diminution of the self-respect of the needy. And that circumstance, I scarcely need to tell you, would be completely inconsistent with the spirit of the holiday, totally incongruous with the commemoration of our Festival of Freedom, which celebrates human thriving and human dignity, not just in Pharaoh's Egypt, but in every generation. I started tonight by asking you to think about when it might have been that the liberation of Passover began. You'll notice that I didn't ask you to think about when liberation ends, because that's the easiest Passover question there is. It doesn't end, right? It never ends. Once we were slaves, and now we are free. That's the most important thing we say at the Seder, and both halves of that sentence are critical. Today we are at ease, but we cannot allow our comfort and privilege to tamp down our deep genetic memory of scarcity and suffering. The story of our ancestors in Egypt isn't a self-contained legend that hovers somewhere off in the distant past, unconnected to our experiences today. It is a spiritual generator that powers and illuminates our Jewish lives today. In every generation, we must act as though we personally came out of Egypt, the Haggadah tells us. Which means that even when we feel safe and comfortable and at home, we're obligated to remember that our experience wasn't always like this, that the past compels us to represent the vulnerable, to extend a hand to the needy. We Jews are really good at remembering our past. Sometimes we need help not to forget our responsibility to work whenever possible to ensure that others will not suffer as we did. Every Passover is a grand celebration of liberation. Part feast, part lecture, part symposium, part autobiography. It is the night at which we transmit the wisdom of our history and recommit ourselves to the religious obligation to join forces with those who liberate and shun those who subjugate. So when Passover ends this weekend and we leave behind our neatly wrapped packages of industrially manufactured matzah, let's make sure, please, that we keep up with our ability to see the world with eyes of people who once were slaves, but now are free. Let us not fail to see those who suffer, to remember the marginalized and the overlooked, the chronically ill and the traumatized, those who are deported and displaced, those evicted and expelled. Let us keep our eyes on the hungry, the hurting, and the hunted. Let us remember those still held in captivity, whose empty chairs at a Seder table hold not the prophetic promise of Elijah, but the reminder that we must still work to set the imprisoned free. This is what is demanded of us by God, by our noble and inspiring Jewish past, and by the commitment made by those who came before us. It is our job to finish writing the story they started. And may the chapter we write together and the lives that we live in its service join together to form a great Haggadah of human dignity and liberty and redemption. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and Chag Sameach.